September 1944. The war is almost over. Allied forces are pushing through Europe like a flood that cannot be stopped. For most Belgians, these are the first days of freedom in 4 long, suffocating years. People are dancing in the streets. Women are crying tears of relief. Children are running toward Allied soldiers with flowers in their hands. But in one quiet courtyard in Belgium, there is no dancing. There is no celebration. There is only one man, standing alone, hands tied back against a wall, and a firing squad pointing directly at him. His name was Louis Collard, and in approximately 60 seconds he would be dead. But the real question, the question that will haunt you by the end of this video, is not how he died. It's why the people pulling those triggers felt absolutely no regret. See, most people think World War II ended with celebrations and champagne. And yes, it did, but it also ended with something far darker, far more personal, far more brutal. It ended with revenge. When the Nazis were finally driven out of occupied Europe, the people they had oppressed for years didn't just move on. They turned around, and they looked for the ones who had helped make their suffering possible. Not just German officers, not just SS commanders. They looked for their own neighbors, their own countrymen, the ordinary men and women who had chosen collaboration over conscience. Louis Collard was one of those men, and his story, from the comfortable office chair of a wartime collaborator to a cold wall in a Belgian courtyard in September 1944, is one of the most brutal, most human, and most complicated stories to come out of the entire Nazi occupation. Because here's what no one tells you about collaborators. They didn't all start as evil men. Some of them started as afraid men. Some started as opportunistic men. Some genuinely believed in those early confusing months of occupation that cooperation was simply survival. Louis Collard told himself a story where he was being practical, a story where he was protecting something. But stories have a way of falling apart when the bodies start piling up around you. Before we go any deeper into what Louis Collard actually did and exactly what happened to him on that September morning, if you are watching this channel for the first time, welcome to Nazi Dark History. This is not a channel for surface-level timelines and textbook summaries. This is where we go into the real stories, the uncomfortable ones, the human ones, the ones that make you sit back and think, how does a man become this? Subscribe right now, because this video is about to go places most history channels never dare to go. May 1940, Germany invades Belgium. 18 days. That's all it took. 18 days for one of the oldest nations in Europe to fall completely under Nazi control. The Belgian army fought, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, overwhelmed. And on May 28, 1940, King Leopold III surrendered. Overnight, everything changed. German soldiers filled the streets of Brussels, Liège, Antwerp. Nazi flags replaced Belgian ones on government buildings. New rules appeared on walls, new curfews, new dangers. For most Belgians, the next 4 years would be defined by one single, exhausting mission. Survive, stay quiet, wait. But Louis Collard did not choose quiet. He looked at the occupation and saw something most of his countrymen refused to see. He saw access. He saw power. He saw a way to matter in a world that had suddenly been completely rewritten. And in 1940, he made his first move toward the Nazis. It started small. It always starts small. A conversation here, a piece of information there. Nothing too dramatic, nothing that felt at the time irreversible. But every step Collard took toward the Nazi machine was a step away from his own people. And by the time liberation came thundering through Belgium in September 1944, Louis Collard had taken far too many steps to ever walk back. The people of Belgium remembered every single one. Here is where the story stops being complicated, because up until now, you might have felt even a small flicker of sympathy for Louis Collard, a man caught in impossible times, a man making difficult choices under occupation. That flicker dies here, because what Louis Collard actually did during those 4 years of occupation was not survival. It was not self-protection. It was betrayal, deliberate, calculated, and deadly. Collard worked as an active collaborator with the Nazi-occupying forces in Belgium, not reluctantly, not under direct threat, actively. He fed information to German authorities. He identified resistance members, men and women who were risking everything to fight back. He helped the Nazi machine locate, arrest, and in many cases destroy, the very people who were trying to save Belgium. Think about what that means for a second. Somewhere in Belgium, a young man joins the resistance. He prints underground newspapers. He hides Jewish families. He passes military intelligence to the Allies. He risks his life every single day, believing that his identity is secret. And then one morning, the Gestapo knocks on his door. Because Louis Collard talked, that young man's fate, arrest, torture, deportation, death, began with a conversation in Collard's office. That is who Louis Collard was. September 2nd, 1944. British forces enter Brussels. The city explodes with joy. 4 years of occupation gone. 4 years of fear, hunger, curfews, and silence, suddenly lifting like smoke clearing after a fire. People poured into the streets by the thousands. Strangers embraced each other. Old men wept openly. But even in that explosion of liberation, even in those first overwhelming hours of freedom, there were people in Brussels who were not celebrating. They were searching, because liberation didn't just mean the Nazis were leaving. It meant the people who helped the Nazis were now completely exposed. No more German protection. No more occupation authority to hide behind. No more power. Just a name. And a city full of people who remembered exactly what that name had done. Louis Collard's name was on a list. And lists like that, in liberated Belgium in September 1944, did not lead to comfortable courtroom trials. Not immediately. When they came for him, Collard did not run. Some collaborators fled. Some changed their names. Some disappeared into the chaos of a continent in transition. But Collard was found, was arrested, was brought before a military tribunal. And here is the moment that separates this story from a simple tale of wartime justice. At his trial, Collard was not some broken, trembling shadow of a man begging for mercy. By multiple accounts, he was composed, almost unnervingly calm, as if some part of him had already accepted, long before the verdict, exactly how this would end. Maybe he had done the calculation in his own head. Every name he gave to the Gestapo, every resistance member he exposed, every Jewish family whose hiding place he revealed. Maybe he already knew the math didn't work in his favor. The tribunal reviewed his case. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies of survivors, people whose loved ones had been arrested and never came back, were devastating. And when the verdict came, it was not a long prison sentence. It was not exile. It was death. Execution by firing squad. And the date was set not weeks away, not months away. Days. Louis Collard had days left to exist on this earth. And somewhere in that cold Belgian cell, a man who had chosen power over conscience finally had to sit alone with every choice he had ever made. The night before an execution is unlike any other night. Time moves differently. Every sound feels sharper. Every shadow feels heavier. The silence in a cell the night before death is a silence that has weight. Louis Collard sat in that silence. We don't know exactly what he thought about in those final hours. We don't know if he prayed. We don't know if he wept. We don't know if he thought about the resistance fighters he had betrayed, the families he had destroyed, the names he had whispered into German ears. But we know one thing with absolute certainty. He knew morning was coming, and morning was the end. Dawn. The courtyard was cold the way only autumn mornings in Belgium can be cold. A sharp, biting chill that cuts straight through clothing and settles in your bones. Louis Collard was brought out. No dramatic final speech. No last-minute confession shouted across the courtyard. Just a man, walking the last steps he would ever take. They positioned him against the wall. That specific wall, cold brick, rough surface, that had become the final backdrop for collaborators across liberated Belgium. His hands were bound behind him. The firing squad stood in position. These were not men who enjoyed this moment. They were men who understood with complete clarity why this moment was necessary. There is a difference. The command was given, and in a fraction of a second, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Louis Collard's story ended. Not with the dramatic last words of a man who had made peace with himself, not with a speech about regret or redemption. Just silence, and then the echo of gunfire bouncing off Belgian stone walls. And then nothing. The man who had fed names to the Gestapo, the man who had helped dismantle the Belgian resistance from the inside, the man who had chosen access and power over conscience and country, was gone. Here is what history books rarely tell you about moments like this. The people who witnessed Collard's execution did not feel relief. They felt exhaustion, because executing Louis Collard did not bring back a single person he had betrayed. It did not undo a single arrest, a single deportation, a single death. Justice, real justice, can never fully repair what collaboration destroyed. And that is perhaps the darkest truth of the entire Nazi occupation era. The damage done by men like Collard, men who were not SS generals, not concentration camp commanders, just ordinary men who chose the wrong side. That damage outlived the war by decades. Families that never healed, communities that never fully trusted each other again, children who grew up without fathers because a man named Louis Collard had a conversation with the wrong people. We talk a lot about the monsters of World War II, Hitler, Himmler, Eichmann, Mengele. And those men were monsters without question. But the Nazi machine did not function on monsters alone. It functioned on ordinary people, people who convinced themselves that cooperation was survival, people who told themselves stories about practicality and pragmatism, while other people paid for those stories with their lives. Louis Collard was not unique. Across every occupied country in Europe, there were hundreds of Louis Collard. And that is the most terrifying lesson of this entire era. Evil does not always arrive wearing a uniform and screaming ideology. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in an office with a pen and a list of names. If this video made you think, if it made you feel something real, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Subscribe to Nazi Dark History, because next week we go even deeper. And trust me, you are not ready for what's coming.